The wind howled like a wild animal across the Montana plains. Margaret pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, but it did little good against the freezing cold. Snow whipped around her face so hard she could barely see 2 feet ahead. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten anything but a small piece of stale bread in 2 days. Margaret was a nurse from Ireland who had come to America looking for a better life. She was 28 years old, with red hair and green eyes that showed her strong spirit. 3 months ago, she thought she had found the perfect job at a mining camp. But the head doctor there didn't like having a woman around who knew as much about medicine as he did. Last week, he fired her, saying she was too stubborn and bossy for a woman. Now she was walking through the worst blizzard Montana had seen in 20 years. Her horse had died 2 days back from the cold. All she had left was a small bag with 3 hard biscuits and an old medical kit her grandmother had given her back in Ireland. The snow was getting deeper with each step. Margaret's boots were old and cracked, letting the cold seep through to her feet. She could feel them going numb. Her hands were so cold she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. She knew she needed to find shelter soon, or she would freeze to death out here. Then, through the swirling snow, she saw something that made her heart jump. A thin line of gray smoke was rising up into the white sky. Where there was smoke, there had to be fire. And fire meant warmth, and maybe even food. Margaret pushed through the deep snow toward the smoke. Her legs felt like lead, and each step was harder than the last. But hope gave her strength. The smoke was coming from a small log cabin tucked between some tall pine trees. The cabin looked old and rough, but to Margaret, it looked like heaven. She stumbled to the door and knocked with her frozen fist. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Margaret tried the door handle, and it turned. The door wasn't locked. "Hello?" she called out as she stepped inside. "Is anyone there? I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm caught in the storm." The inside of the cabin was warm and dim. A fire was burning low in the stone fireplace, filling the small room with orange light. There was a simple table, 2 wooden chairs, and a bed in the corner. But what caught Margaret's attention was the man lying on the bed. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark brown hair. His face was red with fever, and sweat covered his forehead even though the cabin wasn't that warm. His right leg was twisted at a strange angle under a dirty blanket. The man was breathing hard and fast, like he was running a race in his sleep. Margaret's nurse training kicked in right away. She forgot about her own hunger and cold. She could see this man was very sick and needed help immediately. She went over to the bed and put her hand on his forehead. He was burning up with fever. Looking around the cabin, Margaret saw that the man had supplies. There were cans of food on a shelf, a water bucket by the fire, and what looked like whiskey in a brown bottle. But there were also signs of trouble. A rifle was lying on the floor, near the bed, and there were muddy boot prints leading to the door. Margaret checked the man's leg more carefully. It was definitely broken and not set properly. The bone was probably pressing against muscles and blood vessels, making everything worse. If she didn't fix it soon, the man might lose his leg or even die. But helping him would mean using her last bit of food and medicine. Margaret looked at her small bag with the 3 biscuits. That was all the food she had left. Her medical kit had some basic supplies, but once she used them, they would be gone. The man groaned and his eyes fluttered open for a moment. They were dark blue and filled with pain. He looked at her with confusion, like he couldn't understand what he was seeing. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his eyes closed again and he went back to his fevered sleep. Margaret stood there for a long moment thinking. She could take some of this man's food and supplies and continue on her way. He probably wouldn't even remember seeing her. She could leave him here and save herself. After all, she didn't even know who he was. He could be anyone, a criminal, a drunk, or just some unlucky traveler like herself. But Margaret couldn't do it. Her grandmother had taught her that helping others was the most important thing in life. Her training as a nurse had made that feeling even stronger. She couldn't walk away from someone who needed her help, even if it meant putting herself in danger. Margaret took off her wet coat and rolled up her sleeves. She had work to do. First, she built up the fire to make the cabin warmer. Then she heated some water in a pot she found near the fireplace. She opened her medical kit and took out clean bandages, some medicine for fever, and a small bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. Setting the broken leg was going to be the hardest part. Margaret had done it before, but never on someone this big. The man looked like he worked outside a lot. His hands were rough and calloused, and his arms were strong with muscle. Moving his leg was going to take all her strength. Margaret found 2 straight pieces of wood to use as splints. She tore strips from a clean shirt she found in the man's pack. Then she took a deep breath and began to work. When she pulled on his leg to set the bone, the man woke up screaming. His blue eyes were wild with pain and confusion. He tried to sit up and fight her off. "Stop. I'm trying to help you," Margaret said firmly. "Your leg is broken and I need to fix it or you'll get worse." The man looked at her through the haze of fever and pain. Maybe something in her voice told him she was telling the truth. He lay back down and gripped the sides of the bed so hard his knuckles turned white. Margaret worked as quickly as she could, pulling the bone back into place and wrapping the splints tight around his leg. When she was done, the man had passed out again from the pain, but his leg looked much better. Margaret gave him some fever medicine and covered him with all the blankets she could find. Then she made herself one of her precious biscuits into a thin soup with some hot water. She kept most of it for the sick man, eating just a few spoonfuls herself. Her stomach growled with hunger, but she ignored it. For the next several hours, Margaret sat by the bed and took care of the man. She gave him sips of water when he was awake enough to drink. She put cool cloths on his forehead to bring down the fever. She checked his leg to make sure the bleeding had stopped. As night fell, the storm outside got even worse. The wind shook the little cabin like it was a toy. Snow piled up against the windows. Margaret realized she wasn't going anywhere for a while. She used the last of her biscuits to make more soup. Again, she gave most of it to the man and ate just a little herself. She was so hungry now that her hands were shaking. But the man needed the food more than she did. Late that night, the man's fever finally broke. His breathing became easier and his skin felt cooler. Margaret allowed herself to feel a little bit of hope. Maybe he was going to be okay. She found an old blanket and made herself a bed on the floor near the fire. As she lay there listening to the storm, Margaret wondered who this man was. His clothes looked expensive, even though they were dirty now. His boots were made of good leather. There was a fancy pocket watch on the table that looked like it cost more money than Margaret had ever seen. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that she had probably saved his life. And in doing so, she had used up everything she had. Her food was gone. Her medicine was almost gone. She didn't even know if the man would be grateful when he woke up, or if he would just tell her to leave. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight she had done the right thing. Her grandmother would be proud. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the snow continued to fall. But inside the little cabin, 2 strangers had found shelter from the storm. One was fighting for his life, and the other had given up everything to help him. Neither of them knew that this night would change both their lives forever. The fire crackled and popped, sending dancing shadows across the walls. In his sleep, the man's breathing grew steadier. Margaret finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted but satisfied that she had done everything she could. What neither of them knew was that the man Margaret had saved owned more land than anyone else in Montana Territory. His name was James McKinnon, but everyone called him Buck. He was one of the richest and most powerful men in the West, and the woman who had just saved his life with her last bit of food and medicine was about to become the most important person in his world. Margaret woke up to the sound of someone moving around. She opened her eyes and saw the man sitting up in bed, looking much better than the night before. His fever was gone and his blue eyes were clear and alert. He was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was deep and rough from being sick, but much stronger than before. Margaret sat up from her makeshift bed on the floor. "My name is Margaret O'Brien. I'm a nurse. I found you here last night with a broken leg and a high fever. The man looked down at his leg, which was now properly splinted and bandaged. He moved it slightly and winced but nodded with approval. You did this? Yes. You were in bad shape. I thought you might die if someone didn't help you. The man studied her face carefully. You look half-starved. When did you last eat a real meal? Margaret felt her cheeks get warm. She knew she looked terrible. Her red hair was messy and her dress was wrinkled and dirty. She had lost weight over the past few days and her face was probably pale and thin. I've been traveling. Food has been scarce. Traveling in this weather? Are you crazy? The man shook his head. This is the worst blizzard we've had in 20 years. Nobody should be out in this. I didn't have much choice, Margaret said quietly. The man looked at her for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. Well, you're not going anywhere now. Look outside. Margaret went to the window and pushed aside the cloth covering it. What she saw made her heart sink. Snow had piled up almost to the window. The wind was still blowing hard and she couldn't see anything but white in any direction. They were completely snowed in. Looks like we're going to be stuck here for a while, the man said. Good thing this cabin belongs to me. Margaret turned around, surprised. This is your cabin? One of them. I have several scattered around my land for times when I'm out checking on cattle and get caught in bad weather. I was riding back from the north pasture when the storm hit. My horse got spooked and threw me. That's how I broke my leg. What's your name? Margaret asked. The man hesitated for just a moment. Buck McKinnon. Margaret had never heard the name before, but something about the way he said it made her think it was important. Well, Mr. McKinnon, I'm glad you're feeling better. Your fever broke during the night. Call me Buck, and I owe you my life. If you hadn't found me and set that leg. He shook his head. I was in a bad way. Margaret felt embarrassed by his thanks. Any nurse would have done the same thing. No, Buck said firmly. Not any nurse would have used her last bit of food to make soup for a stranger. I saw the empty bag over there. You gave me everything you had, didn't you? Margaret didn't answer, but her silence was answer enough. Buck tried to get up from the bed but fell back with a grunt of pain. My leg's not ready for walking yet. But I can still take care of making us some food. There's plenty here. Canned beans, dried meat, flour for biscuits. You must be starving. For the next hour, Buck directed Margaret around the cabin, telling her where to find supplies and how to use the old cast-iron stove. Soon the small space was filled with the wonderful smell of cooking food. Margaret's stomach growled so loudly that Buck laughed. When did you last eat? He asked again. I had a small piece of bread 3 days ago, Margaret admitted. Buck's face grew serious. 3 days. No wonder you look ready to fall over. Sit down and eat before you collapse. The meal was simple, beans, bacon, and fresh biscuits, but to Margaret it tasted like the finest food she had ever eaten. She tried to eat slowly and politely, but she was so hungry that she couldn't help herself. Buck watched her with a sad expression. Tell me about yourself, Buck said as they ate. What's a nurse from Ireland by your accent doing wandering around Montana in the middle of winter? Margaret told him about her life. She had been born in a small village in Ireland during the potato famine. Her parents and younger brother had died of starvation when she was 16. An aunt had paid for her passage to America and helped her get training as a nurse in Boston. I wanted to go somewhere I could really help people, Margaret explained. The frontier seemed like a place where medical help was desperately needed. I took a job at a mining camp about 50 miles from here. What happened there? Margaret's face got red with anger. The head doctor there was Dr. Williams. He was a drunk who could barely set a broken finger, let alone perform surgery. But he didn't like having a woman around who knew more about medicine than he did. He said I was too bold and argumentative for a woman. Last week he fired me and told everyone in the camp that I was a troublemaker. Buck nodded thoughtfully. So you were heading where? Billings, I hoped. I heard there might be work there. But I got caught in the storm. Margaret looked down at her hands. I spent all my money getting to that mining camp. When they fired me, I didn't have enough left for a train ticket or even a decent horse. I was walking and hoping to find work along the way. Walking to Billings? That's over 100 miles from here. I didn't have any other choice. Buck was quiet for a while, just looking at her. Margaret couldn't tell what he was thinking. Finally, he said, "What about family? Isn't there anyone who could help you?" Margaret shook her head. "My aunt in Boston died 2 years ago. I don't have anyone else." The next few days passed in a strange kind of peaceful routine. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, Margaret and Buck settled into an easy partnership. Margaret took care of Buck's medical needs, changing his bandages and making sure his leg was healing properly. Buck, even though he couldn't walk much, helped with cooking and keeping the fire going. They talked for hours every day. Margaret learned that Buck was originally from Texas. His parents had died when he was young, and he had come to Montana with nothing but a horse and a dream of raising cattle. Through hard work and some good luck, he had built up a successful ranch. "How big is your ranch?" Margaret asked one day as she was checking his leg. Buck seemed uncomfortable with the question. "Pretty big. I have a lot of cattle." "How many?" "A few thousand." Margaret stopped what she was doing and stared at him. "A few thousand? That's a huge ranch." "I've been lucky," Buck said simply. But Margaret was starting to realize that Buck might be more than just a successful rancher. His clothes, even dirty and torn from his accident, were made of expensive materials. His pocket watch was solid gold. And the way he talked sometimes, like he was used to people listening to him and doing what he said, made her think he might be someone important. Buck, for his part, was amazed by Margaret's knowledge and strength. She knew more about medicine than most doctors he had met. She could cook, sew, and take care of practical problems around the cabin. But more than that, she was smart and funny and had strong opinions about everything. "You really think women should be allowed to vote?" Buck asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "Of course, women have brains just like men. We can think and make decisions about what's best for the country," Margaret said firmly. "But don't you think men are better at making those kinds of big decisions?" Margaret gave him a look that could have melted snow. "Mr. McKinnon, I've seen plenty of men make terrible decisions. The doctor who fired me was a man, and he couldn't make a good decision if his life depended on it. My father, God rest his soul, was a good man, but he made some very bad choices about money that left our family in poverty. And the politicians back east who are supposed to be so smart, they're the ones who let the railroad companies cheat farmers and workers." Buck held up his hands in surrender. "You make a good point." As the days went by, Buck found himself looking forward to these conversations. Margaret challenged him in ways that no one had in years. Most people agreed with whatever he said because of his wealth and position, but Margaret didn't know about any of that. She treated him just like a regular person, and he found he liked it. Margaret, meanwhile, was discovering that Buck was nothing like the rough cowboy she had expected to find in Montana. He was educated and well-read. He could discuss books and politics and had opinions about art and music. But he was also practical and tough, with calloused hands that showed he wasn't afraid of hard work. One night, about a week after Margaret had found Buck, she woke up to hear him groaning in his sleep. She went over to check on him and found that he was having a nightmare. He was sweating and mumbling something about cattle thieves and losing everything. "Buck," she said softly, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up. You're having a bad dream." Buck's eyes opened and he looked around wildly for a moment before recognizing where he was. "Sorry. Did I wake you? Are you all right? You seemed really upset." Buck sat up and ran his hands through his hair. "Just a bad dream. I've been having them a lot lately." "About what?" Buck was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I've got some problems back at my ranch. Nothing you need to worry about." But Margaret could see that whatever these problems were, they were weighing heavily on Buck's mind. She sat down on the chair next to his bed. "Sometimes it helps to talk about things," she said gently. Buck looked at her in the firelight. Her red hair looked like copper, and her green eyes were full of kindness. He found himself wanting to tell Her everything. About the cattle rustlers who had been stealing from his herd, about the railroad company that wanted to buy his land, and on the 10th morning, Margaret woke up to silence. The constant howling of the wind had stopped. She looked out the window and saw blue sky for the first time in over a week. The storm was finally over. "Buck, wake up," she called softly. "The weather's cleared." Buck opened his eyes and listened. "You're right. I can probably make it back to the main ranch today if I take it slow." Margaret felt a strange sadness at those words. She had known this day would come, but she wasn't ready for it. The past week and a half had been the happiest time she could remember in years. Despite being trapped in a tiny cabin with a stranger, she had felt more at home than she had since leaving Ireland. "How far is your ranch from here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "About 5 miles through the woods. Not too far if the snow isn't too deep." Buck got up slowly, testing his weight on his injured leg. It was still sore and weak, but he could walk on it with the help of a walking stick Margaret had made for him. "What about you?" Buck asked. "You're not still thinking about walking to Billings, are you?" Margaret had been thinking about this all night. Her feet were still healing from frostbite, and she knew Buck was right about the danger of traveling alone in winter. But she also knew she couldn't stay in this cabin forever. "Maybe I could find work in a closer town," she said. "Do you know of any places that might need a nurse?" Buck nodded. "There's a town called Cedar Falls about 20 miles south of here. It's not very big, but it's growing. They might need someone with medical training." What Buck didn't tell Margaret was that Cedar Falls was right next to his ranch. The town had grown up around his cattle operation, and most of the people there worked for him in some way. He could easily arrange for Margaret to find work there, and then he would be able to see her again. They packed up their few belongings in silence. Margaret felt awkward and sad. She didn't know how to say goodbye to this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. Buck was having the same problem. He wanted to ask Margaret to come with him to his ranch, but he was afraid she would say no. He was also afraid of what his ranch hands and the people in town would think about him bringing home a strange woman. "Margaret," Buck said as they prepared to leave the cabin, "I want you to take some of my supplies, food, a warm coat, boots that actually fit." Margaret shook her head. "I can't take your things. You saved my life. It's the least I can do. You already shared your food with me for over a week. That's more than enough." Buck looked frustrated. "You're too proud for your own good, and you're too generous for yours." Despite their argument, Buck managed to convince Margaret to take some basic supplies, food for a few days, a thick coat that would keep her warm, and a pair of boots that were too small for him, but fit her perfectly. They walked together through the snow-covered forest. Buck moved slowly because of his leg, and Margaret stayed close to help him if he stumbled. The world around them was beautiful and peaceful, with sunlight sparkling on the fresh snow and the sound of their footsteps the only noise. After about an hour of walking, they came to the top of a hill. Buck stopped and pointed down into the valley below. "There's my ranch," he said. Margaret looked where he was pointing and her mouth fell open. She had expected to see a simple farmhouse with maybe a barn and a few cattle. Instead, she was looking at what seemed like a small town. There was a huge main house with 2 stories and a wide front porch. Around it were dozens of other buildings, barns, bunkhouses, storage sheds, and work areas. Hundreds of cattle dotted the snowy fields, and she could see at least 20 horses in various corrals. "Buck," Margaret said slowly, "this isn't just a ranch, this is enormous." Buck looked uncomfortable. "I told you I had a lot of cattle." "A lot of cattle? There must be thousands of them. And that house, it's like a mansion." Margaret turned to stare at Buck with new eyes. Suddenly everything made sense. The expensive clothes, the gold watch, the way he carried himself with natural authority. Buck McKinnon wasn't just a successful rancher. He was rich. Really, really rich. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked quietly. Buck ran his hand through his hair nervously. "Would it have mattered? I don't know. But you let me think you were just a regular cowboy. I am just a regular cowboy. I work my land and take care of my cattle just like anyone else. But Margaret was backing away from him, shaking her head. No, you're not. You're wealthy, important, and I'm just a poor Irish girl with nothing to my name. Margaret, don't do this. What happened between us in that cabin was real. It had nothing to do with money. But Margaret couldn't hear him over the voice in her head telling her what a fool she had been. For over a week, she had been talking to Buck like an equal, challenging his opinions, even arguing with him. She had shared her deepest thoughts and feelings with him. But the whole time, he was probably laughing at her inside, amused by the poor immigrant girl who didn't know her place. I have to go, Margaret said, turning away from the ranch. Where are you going? Cedar Falls, like we discussed. Buck grabbed her arm gently. Margaret, please. Don't leave like this. Let me explain. But at that moment, they heard the sound of horses coming through the woods. 3 men on horseback came into view, clearly ranch hands looking for their boss. When they saw Buck, they spurred their horses forward. Mr. McKinnon, the lead rider called. Thank God you're alive. We've been looking for you for days. The man was tall and weathered, with graying hair and the look of someone who had spent his whole life working outdoors. When he reached them, he jumped down from his horse and looked Buck up and down with concern. Are you hurt, boss? We found your horse 3 days ago, but with the storm. I'm fine, Tom. Broke my leg, but it's healing. This is Margaret O'Brien. She's the one who found me and probably saved my life. Tom looked at Margaret with curiosity and respect. Ma'am, we owe you a debt we can never repay. Mr. McKinnon is, well, he's important to a lot of people around here. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Even the ranch hands talked about Buck like he was someone special. She felt smaller and more out of place by the minute. Can one of you men escort Miss O'Brien to Cedar Falls? Buck asked. She's looking for work there. Tom nodded. Of course, boss. But are you sure you don't want to ride back to the house first? Rosa's been worried sick, and you need to see Doc Peterson about that leg. Buck hesitated, looking at Margaret. She could see he wanted to say something more to her, but with his men there watching, the moment was gone. You're right, Buck said finally. Margaret, are you sure about Cedar Falls? Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She felt confused and hurt and angry all at the same time. The past week had felt like a fairy tale, but now reality was crashing down around her. One of the other ranch hands, a young man with blonde hair, offered to accompany Margaret to town. As they rode away, Margaret couldn't help but look back at Buck. He was standing there watching her go, leaning on his walking stick, and she could see sadness in his blue eyes. But she forced herself to turn away. Whatever she had thought was happening between them, it was impossible now. He was Buck McKinnon, owner of the biggest ranch in Montana Territory. She was just Margaret O'Brien, a poor nurse with no family and no future. Cedar Falls turned out to be a busy little town with one main street lined with shops, a hotel, a saloon, and various other businesses. The ranch hand, whose name was Billy, took her to the hotel and helped her get a room. Don't worry about the cost, Billy said when Margaret protested. Mr. McKinnon said to put it on his account. I can't let him pay for my hotel room. Billy looked confused. Ma'am, begging your pardon, but why not? He's got more money than he knows what to do with, and you saved his life. It's nothing to him. That was exactly the problem, Margaret thought. It was nothing to him because everything was nothing to him. He was so rich that paying for her hotel room was like buying a newspaper. Over the next few days, Margaret tried to settle into life in Cedar Falls. She visited the town's only doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Peterson, and asked about work. Could certainly use another pair of skilled hands, Dr. Peterson said, but I have to warn you, people here can be particular about outsiders. Margaret soon found out what he meant. Cedar Falls was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and everyone knew that the strange Irish woman had arrived with one of Buck McKinnon's men. The rumors started almost immediately. At the general store, Margaret overheard 2 women talking. Did you see that red-headed woman who came in with Billy? The Irish one? I heard she was alone with Mr. McKinnon for over a week. Alone? In a cabin? For a week? That's not proper. Well, what do you expect from a foreign woman? They don't have the same moral standards we do. Margaret's face burned, with shame and anger. She wanted to tell them the truth, that she had saved Buck's life, that she had been a perfect lady the entire time, that nothing improper had happened. But she knew it wouldn't matter. People had already made up their minds about her. The whispering and stares continued everywhere she went. At the hotel dining room, conversations stopped when she walked in. At the church on Sunday, people looked at her sideways and whispered behind their hands. The worst part was that some of the criticism was coming from people. Margaret spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about Buck's proposal. She walked around Cedar Falls trying to imagine herself as the wife of the most powerful man in the territory. The more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. The 4th morning, she made her decision. She would tell Buck no, thank him for his kindness, and ask him to help her get to Billings where she could start fresh somewhere no one knew her story. But when she went to find Buck at his ranch, she discovered something that changed everything. Margaret arrived at the Diamond M Ranch just as Dr. Harrison was leaving. He rode past her with a smug look on his face, tipping his hat in a way that seemed more mocking than polite. "Miss O'Brien," he said, "I hope you're not here to interfere with my medical practice again." Margaret ignored him and continued toward the main house. Buck met her at the front door and she could see worry in his blue eyes. "Margaret, I'm glad you're here. We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "It's Catherine Lopez. The woman you were concerned about. She's gotten worse and Dr. Harrison says there's nothing more he can do." Margaret felt her blood run cold. "Where is she?" Buck led her to one of the smaller houses on the ranch property where the married workers lived with their families. Inside, Margaret found Catherine lying in bed, pale and weak. Her husband, Miguel, was sitting beside her, holding her hand and looking terrified. Margaret knelt beside the bed and quickly examined Catherine. What she saw made her angry and frightened. The woman was much worse than she had been a week ago. She was bleeding internally, and Margaret could tell that both Catherine and her baby were in serious danger. "How long has she been like this?" Margaret asked Miguel. 3 days, Miguel said in heavily accented English. "She got worse after Dr. Harrison gave her medicine. He said it would help, but—" Margaret examined the bottle of medicine Dr. Harrison had left. When she read the label, she gasped. It was a strong tonic that was completely wrong for Catherine's condition. In fact, it could have made her symptoms much worse. "Buck," Margaret said urgently, "I need to get Catherine to my room at the hotel right away, and I need supplies, clean sheets, hot water, and some herbs if you have them." "What's wrong with her?" "She's bleeding inside. The baby is in the wrong position, and Dr. Harrison's medicine made everything worse. If we don't help her soon, we're going to lose both her and the child." Buck didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you need." For the next 18 hours, Margaret worked to save Catherine's life. Buck stayed with her the entire time, following her instructions and helping however he could. Several other ranch wives came to assist, including Rosa, Buck's housekeeper, who turned out to know a lot about difficult births. Margaret had to use every bit of medical knowledge she had learned over the years. She carefully repositioned the baby, stopped the internal bleeding, and monitored both mother and child through a long and dangerous labor. At dawn, Catherine Lopez gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Both mother and child were going to be fine. Miguel cried with relief and gratitude. "Miss Margaret, you saved my wife and my son. How can I ever thank you?" Margaret was exhausted but happy. Just take good care of them both. As word spread through the ranch about what had happened, people began coming to see Margaret with a new kind of respect. She had done something Dr. Harrison said was impossible. She had saved 2 lives that he had given up on. But the real test came that afternoon when Dr. Harrison himself arrived at the ranch. He was furious. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, storming into the main house where Margaret was, resting. "You have no right to treat patients. You're not a real doctor." Margaret stood up to face him even though she was tired and her hands were still shaky from the long night of work. "I saved Catherine's life. That's what I was doing. You got lucky, and you had no business interfering with my treatment. Your treatment was killing her, Margaret shot back. That medicine you gave her was completely wrong for her condition. Any first-year medical student would know that. Dr. Harrison's face turned red with rage. How dare you question my medical training? I'll have you arrested for practicing medicine without a license. Buck, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. Dr. Harrison, I think you should leave. Mr. McKinnon, you need to control this woman. She's dangerous. The only dangerous thing I see here is your medical practice. Catherine Lopez and her baby are alive because Margaret knew what she was doing and you didn't. I won't stand for this humiliation. Dr. Harrison turned to Margaret with hatred in his eyes. You think you've won something here, but you're wrong. I'll make sure everyone in this territory knows what kind of woman you really are. A foreign troublemaker who seduces wealthy men and pretends to be something she's not. Margaret felt like she had been slapped. But before she could respond, Buck stepped between them. Get out, Buck said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it that made Dr. Harrison take a step back. Get off my land and don't come back. You'll regret this, McKinnon. Both of you will regret this. After Dr. Harrison left, Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly feeling all her exhaustion. He's right about one thing, she said quietly. This is going to cause more trouble. Buck knelt beside her chair. Margaret, what you did today was amazing. You saved 2 lives, and made an enemy who's going to make life difficult for both of us. Buck took her hands in his. I don't care about Dr. Harrison or anyone else who wants to cause trouble. I care about you. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something there that made her heart race. It wasn't just gratitude or admiration. It was love, real, deep, honest love, Buck, she said softly. About your proposal. Have you made a decision? Margaret took a deep breath. I want to say yes, but I'm scared. Scared of what? Scared that I'll never fit into your world? Scared that people will always see me as the poor Irish girl who married above her station? Scared that someday you'll realize you made a mistake. Buck squeezed her hands. Margaret, I have a confession to make. I've been engaged before. Margaret felt her heart sink. Oh, her name was Victoria Ashworth. She was from a wealthy family back in Chicago. Beautiful, educated, everything a man like me was supposed to want. We were engaged for 6 months. What happened? She came out here to see the ranch before our wedding. She took one look at Montana and decided it was too rough and wild for a proper lady. She said I could either sell the ranch and move back to Chicago, or she would break off the engagement. Margaret was quiet, waiting for him to continue. I chose the ranch, Buck said. And I never regretted it until I met you. Why would you regret it? Because Victoria was exactly what everyone expected me to marry. She would have been accepted by society, approved of by everyone. Marrying her would have been easy. Buck stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his vast ranch. But you know what? I never once felt about Victoria the way I feel about you. I never wanted to share my thoughts with her the way I do with you. I never felt like she really saw me, the real me, not just the wealthy rancher. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. Buck. He turned back to her. Margaret, I'm not asking you to become someone else. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, but to do it as my wife and my partner. Your partner? That's what I want. Not just a wife who looks pretty at parties and keeps quiet when the men are talking. I want someone who challenges me, who makes me think who can work beside me to build something even better than what we have now. Margaret thought about the past 24 hours. She had worked alongside Buck to save Catherine's life, and they had made a perfect team. He had trusted her medical knowledge and followed her instructions without question, and when Dr. Harrison had attacked her, Buck had defended her without hesitation. What exactly are you proposing? Margaret asked. Buck smiled. I'm proposing that we get married, but not in the traditional way. I want you to be my equal partner in running this ranch. I want you to establish a medical clinic here to serve all the families in the area. I want you to help me make decisions about the business. I want you to be the queen of the Diamond M Ranch in every sense of the word. Margaret stared at him. You want me to help run the ranch? But I don't know anything about cattle or business. You'll learn, And I'll learn from you too. Margaret, you have the smartest, most practical mind I've ever encountered. You see solutions to problems that other people miss. You understand people and how to organize them. Those skills aren't just useful for medicine, they're useful for everything. Margaret felt the excitement building in her chest. You really mean it? You want me as a true partner, not just a decorative wife? I mean it completely. Margaret stood up and walked to the window beside Buck. She looked out at the vast ranch, the cattle, the workers, the endless rolling hills. For the first time, instead of feeling intimidated by its size and wealth, she felt excited by its possibilities. There's one condition, she said finally. What's that? I want a trial period, 3 months. I'll work here as your medical officer, I suppose. If at the end of 3 months we both still feel the same way, and if I can prove that I can handle this life, then we'll get married. Buck grinned. Deal. But what will people say about you living and working here unmarried? Margaret smiled back at him. Let them talk. I've learned that people are... The wedding of Buck McKinnon and Margaret O'Brien became the biggest event anyone in Montana Territory could remember. But it almost didn't happen at all. 3 days before the planned ceremony, Dr. Harrison made his final attempt to destroy Margaret's reputation and break up her engagement to Buck. He spread a story through town claiming that Margaret wasn't really a trained nurse at all, but a fraud who had seduced Buck while he was weak and helpless from his injuries. The story might have worked, except that Catherine Lopez heard about it. Catherine, the young mother whose life Margaret had saved, was furious. She gathered together all the other women Margaret had helped, ranch wives who had difficult pregnancies, children with fevers, workers with injuries. Together, they marched into town and confronted anyone who would listen. Dr. Harrison told me my baby and I were going to die, Catherine announced in the town square. He said there was nothing anyone could do. But Miss Margaret saved both our lives. She stayed up all night working to help us, and she never asked for anything in return. One by one, the other women told their stories. Margaret had delivered babies when Dr. Harrison was too drunk to come. She had treated infections that Dr. Harrison said would heal on their own. She had set broken bones that Dr. Harrison said didn't need setting. By the time the women were finished, everyone in Cedar Falls knew the truth. Margaret O'Brien was a real nurse with real skills who had helped more people in a few months than Dr. Harrison had helped in a year. Dr. Harrison left town that same day, and no one was sorry to see him go. The wedding took place on a beautiful spring morning in May. Margaret had worried about what to wear since she owned nothing fancy enough for such an important occasion. But Rosa, Buck's housekeeper, and the other ranch women had worked together to create the most beautiful wedding dress anyone had ever seen. The dress was made of white silk that Buck had ordered specially from San Francisco. It was simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a high neck that was proper, but still showed Margaret's natural beauty. The women had embroidered Irish shamrocks around the hem and added a veil made from lace that had belonged to Buck's mother. The ceremony took place on the front lawn of the main ranch house, under a huge oak tree that Buck's father had planted 30 years before. The preacher came from the nearest big town, since Cedar Falls still didn't have its own church. But it seemed like everyone from 100 miles around came to see Buck McKinnon marry his Irish bride. Margaret had expected the wedding to be awkward, with her having no family there and being so different from the kind of bride people expected Buck to choose. But instead, it became a celebration that brought together the whole frontier community. Miguel Lopez, the ranch hand whose wife Margaret had saved, played his guitar and sang Mexican love songs. The Scottish settlers from the next valley over brought their bagpipes. The German farming family brought apple strudel made from their grandmother's recipe. Even some of the local Native American families came, bringing beautiful blankets as wedding gifts. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the marriage, there was total silence. Then Tom, Buck's foreman, called out, "We all think he's lucky to get her." Everyone laughed and cheered. During the ceremony, Margaret couldn't stop smiling. She looked out at all the faces watching her, people who had once whispered about her behind her back, but who now accepted her as one of their own. She had earned their respect not through marriage or money, but through her own actions and abilities. When Buck slipped the simple gold wedding band on her finger, Margaret felt like she was in a dream. 6 months ago, she had been a starving woman walking through a blizzard with no hope for the future. Now she was marrying the man she loved and becoming part of a community that had welcomed her. The party after the ceremony lasted until dawn. There was dancing and music and more food than anyone could eat. Buck and Margaret danced their first dance as husband and wife to a waltz played by a little band made up of ranch hands and townspeople. "Are you happy?" Buck asked as they swayed together under the stars. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Margaret replied, "but also a little scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that I'll wake up and discover this was all a wonderful dream." Buck laughed and spun her around. "It's real, Mrs. McKinnon. You're stuck with me now." Mrs. McKinnon. Margaret had never thought a name could sound so beautiful. But the real work of their marriage was just beginning. Over the next few months, Margaret threw herself into her new role as Buck's partner and the lady of the Diamond M Ranch. She started by establishing the medical clinic she had dreamed of. Buck converted one of the ranch buildings into a proper medical facility, with clean rooms, good lighting, and all the supplies Margaret needed. Word spread quickly that the Diamond M had a real nurse who could handle everything from childbirth to broken bones to serious illnesses. People began coming from hundreds of miles away to seek Margaret's help. She delivered babies for families who lived so far from town that they had never seen a doctor. She treated injuries that would have crippled men for life if left untreated. She even performed simple surgeries when necessary, having learned the techniques from textbooks Buck ordered for her from back east. But Margaret's contributions to the ranch went far beyond medicine. She had a natural talent for organization and problem-solving that made everything run more smoothly. When the ranch hands complained about the quality of their food, Margaret worked with Rosa to improve the menu and taught the cook new recipes that were both nutritious and tasty. When there were conflicts between workers from different backgrounds, Margaret found ways to bring them together and help them understand each other. She also proved to have a sharp head for business. Margaret suggested improvements to the way the ranch tracked its cattle and managed its finances. She negotiated better prices with suppliers and found new markets for the ranch's products. Within a year, the Diamond M was more profitable than it had ever been. The biggest test of Margaret's new position came when the Montana Railroad Company made another attempt to force Buck to sell part of his land. This time, they came with proper legal documents and the backing of powerful politicians from back east. The railroad representatives expected to deal with Buck man to man, but Buck surprised them by including Margaret in all the negotiations. At first, the railroad men were annoyed and dismissive. "Mr. McKinnon, surely your wife doesn't need to be involved in business discussions," said Mr. Hartwell, the head negotiator. "My wife is my partner," Buck replied firmly. "Any decisions about this ranch are made by both of us." Margaret studied the railroad's proposal carefully. She saw immediately that while the railroad was offering what seemed like a fair price for the land, they were actually trying to get access to a water source that would be worth far more than they were paying. "This water rights clause is unacceptable," Margaret said, pointing to a section of the contract. "You're asking for access to our main water source, which would hurt our cattle operation." Mr. Hartwell looked annoyed. "Mrs. McKinnon, I don't think you understand the complexities of railroad development." Margaret smiled sweetly. "I understand that you want our water without paying for it. That's not complex at all." The negotiations went on for several days. Margaret proved to be a tough negotiator who couldn't be intimidated or fooled by legal language. In the end, the railroad agreed to pay 3 times their original offer and gave up their claim to the water rights. After the railroad men left, Buck looked at Margaret with amazement. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" "From growing up poor," Margaret said with a grin. "When you've had to bargain for everything you've ever needed, you learn to spot a bad deal quickly." Word of Margaret's success in the railroad negotiations spread throughout the territory. Other ranchers began asking for her advice on their own business deals. She became known not just as Buck McKinnon's wife, but as a smart businesswoman in her own right. But perhaps Margaret's greatest success was in bringing the community together. She organized events that brought together people from different backgrounds: Irish immigrants, German settlers, Mexican ranch hands, Native American families, and longtime American residents. She started a school for the children of ranch workers, teaching them reading, writing, and basic medical care. She also worked to improve conditions for women in the territory. Margaret taught other women basic medical skills so they could help their families when doctors weren't available. She fought for women to have more say in community decisions. She even convinced several other ranchers to hire women for jobs that had always been considered men's work. 5 years after their wedding, Buck and Margaret were sitting on their front porch watching the sunset when Margaret made an announcement that changed their lives again.